Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all enjoying a great week. I appreciate you spending part of your morning with us for the Fast Chat. I am Rochelle Thomas, Energy Manager with the San Joaquin Valley Clean Energy Organization, and we are here with the Fast Chat every second Tuesday of the month. We work really hard to bring you financing and project information in a way that works best for your schedule. Fast. I recently received notification that the WIFIA program, that's the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Program, um, they announced their 2020 funding allocation. This program's been around for a few years, and when I looked at the listing of projects they've selected to fund over the past 3 years, the thing that jumped out at me was that none of our local government partners were on any of these lists. In fact, there really wasn't any representation in the Central Valley, maybe one or two near the Central Coast. But again, none of the partners that we work closely with. So I'm not entirely sure why that is. However, my goal for us this morning is to remove lack of awareness from the list of possibilities. Okay, so before I dive in, we'll take care of our housekeeping really quickly. All of your microphones were muted upon joining the call. If you have any questions at all, please go ahead and submit them through the chat box at any point during the presentation. I highly encourage you to submit your questions as soon as you think of them, because if you're anything like me, you might forget. Um, we'll be sure to designate time at the end to address those questions. If you do submit a question and for some reason we aren't able to get to it, I might have to do some additional research to make sure that those responses are accurate, or we may just run out of time. Keep an eye out for our follow-up email. We always provide responses to any unanswered questions that we get during the presentation. We also provide you with a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as links to any other resources we discussed during the call. Deal? Okay, now we can jump in. As I mentioned a moment ago, WIFIA stands for the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. This legislation was signed into law in 2014. It's a federal credit program administered by EPA to support eligible water and wastewater infrastructure projects. The next NOFA will be around $5.5 billion. If there's anyone on the call that's not familiar with what a NOFA, or Notice of Funding Availability, is, once Congress has made their budget appropriations for the year, WIFIA will make their Notice of Funding Availability announcement, which is a solicitation for agencies to apply for the funding. So WIFIA for the last 2 years has released their NOFA in like the first couple of weeks in April. So we can kind of take a look, kind of keep an eye out for that rather. Small disclaimer here, there is a tremendous amount of information on these WIFIA loans. I'm going to do my very best this morning to give you the Reader's Digest. There's so much to unpack, but my goal here is to give you enough information so that you can make a decision as to if it's right for you to, look into it a bit further or not. So let's talk about who is eligible. Eligible borrowers for this program are government agencies, local, state, and federal governments, as well as tribal governments, partnerships and joint ventures, corporations and trusts, also Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, or SRF, program participants. I'd like to call a little bit of special attention to that last qualifier, the State Revolving Fund. The WIFIA program covers 49% of the eligible costs of projects. So there's a lot of opportunity here to layer this program with the SRF to fill in any gaps up to the remaining 51%. I'll explain a bit more in detail about that in just a moment. Some features of the program. Now, there is a minimum project size. So for the most part, With this program, these are relatively large projects. There's a $20 million minimum project size for large communities. The term communities here is referring to the number of people that will be served by your project. The minimum project size for small communities is 5 million. So a small community for these purposes has a population of 25,000 people or less. So there is a differentiation between larger municipalities and smaller ones. Um, the maximum portion of an eligible project that can be funded with WIFIA is 49%. As I mentioned earlier, federal assistance may not exceed 80% of any project's eligible costs. Now, you might be wondering, how can the remaining 51% of costs be covered if the federal assistance is capped at 80%? Well, an SRF loan made from capitalization grant funds would be subject to the 80% limitation on federal funding for a WIFIA project. However, an SRF loan from other sources would not be considered federal funding and can be used to exceed the 80%. So this means that SRF programs, when using non-federal sources of funding, can provide loans for the non-WIFIA share of 51% of eligible project costs. There is a 35-year maximum final maturity requirement. So the total basically says that the total term of the loan can be up to 35 years, and the clock begins when the project is substantially complete. And payments can be deferred for up to 5 years after the project is substantially complete, which is kind of nice because it gives you time to line up revenues from the project before you have to start making your first payment. Um, Interest rates are also equal to the US Treasury rate for similar maturity. And finally, the project must be credit worthy and have a dedicated source of revenue. There are a few things to keep in mind about the evaluation process for a WIFIA loan application. The evaluative process, of course, is objective. So all project proposals are evaluated against the same criteria. The evaluative process is also competitive. The primary aspects of the project being evaluated are the letter of interest or LOI for eligibility, creditworthiness, technical feasibility, readiness to proceed to construction, and the project's ability to meet the strategic objectives outlined in the WIFIA statute and regulation. Eligible projects are then scored using criteria and points outlined in the Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA. And once they're scored, they're ranked. So projects are invited to apply to the WIFIA loan up to and until all of the funding is exhausted. So it really is in your agency's best interest to apply quickly once that NOFA comes out, because in some respects, it's kind of a first come, first serve basis. So a moment ago, I mentioned some of the criteria, the letter of interest and the project credit worthiness. I'll get into a little bit more detail on that. So the letter of interest is kind of your foot in the door item, so to speak. This gets the ball rolling on even being considered for this funding. So broadly speaking, this is kind of how you sell your concept of the project. A letter of interest must contain all criteria set forth in the WIFIA handbook and provide enough information to validate the eligibility of the prospective borrower and the proposed project, perform a preliminary creditworthiness assessment, perform a preliminary engineering feasibility analysis, and also supply the WIFIA program with information to evaluate the project against certain criteria that's defined in the NOFA, or the Notice of Funding Availability. Additional components of the letter of interest are detailed in the WIFIA handbook. I'll provide some links to that information at the end of the call. Please also keep in mind, I know a lot of this stuff might sound kind of intimidating, but we're always here to help assist you through this process. So we're available to help you draft the letter of interest and point you towards some technical assistance resources. So if you are interested in taking this step, but you're worried about dedicating the time, especially in these very beginning steps, please reach out to us. Um, I'll move on to credit worthiness. This is your agency's ability to demonstrate a reasonable assurance of repayment over the term of the loan. So to determine this, they take into account terms and conditions of the proposed financing, uh, financial structure and security features of the proposed financing, your dedicated revenue source that will secure the fund for the project, any financial assumptions and financial soundness, like credit history and outlook of the prospective borrower. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits. Um, there's quite a few benefits to participating in the YFIA program, most of which I've mentioned already, but just to highlight them here. A single fixed interest rate is established at loan closing, so you don't have to worry about those numbers changing. Although a borrower may receive multiple disbursements over several years, for example, the project is completed, um, or once the project is completed, the interest rate will remain fixed. The interest rate is equal to the US Treasury rate of a similar maturity. So on the date of closing, the US Treasury interest rate is verified and that becomes your interest rate. Additionally, the rate is calculated using the weighted average life of the loan rather than the loan maturity date. So this also results in lower interest. Also, as I mentioned earlier, your interest rate is not impacted by by the borrower's credit or loan structure. All borrowers receive the AAA Treasury rate regardless of their credit rating. So that's definitely a plus. Customized repayment schedules is another benefit. Borrowers can customize their payments to align more closely with what they're anticipating their revenues and expenses will look like. So there's flexibility there. The repayment period is another benefit. I mentioned loan terms can be up to 35 years after the substantial completion of the project. So this allows for smaller payments over a longer period of time to pay off the balance. Also, payments can be deferred for up to 5 years after the project's substantial completion. I also mentioned this a few moments ago. This kind of gives the borrower time to start the flow of revenue that will support the project before they're responsible for making those initial payments again. Lastly, YFIA may, under certain circumstances, take a subordinate position in payment priority. So this really comes in handy if the agency ever, down the line runs into any financial difficulty. And then also, YFIA loans can be combined with various other funding sources, such as private equity, revenue bonds, corporate debt, grants, and of course, the State Revolving Loan Fund, or the SRF. So those are also some pretty good upsides, but there's also some downsides, like with everything else. Um, the administrative costs to implement this program are completely carried by the borrower. And just to give you a disclaimer here, they're fairly substantial at first glance. So the fees come in the form of application fees and credit financing fees. The application fee for small communities that's less than 25,000 people is $25,000, and the application fee for all other communities is $100,000. YFIA requires this fee to begin the financial, engineering, and legal analysis of the project, and kind of to make sure that agencies have some skin in the game, so to speak. In addition to the application fees, there are credit processing fees that are also assessed upon the closing of the loan. The application fees are actually credited to the credit processing fees. So it's not like, those application fees just kind of go off into the abyss. They are credited to your account, so to speak. So complicated transactions with lengthy negotiations will naturally have higher costs, but WIFIA's general guideline is between $350,000 and $700,000 in cost per project. And so this is generally broken down in the following services: financial advising services, law firm services, and engineering firms. So and also servicing fees can also range between $12,000 and $15,000 per year per loan. So these are really significant fees. However, it appears that they cover an extensive amount of services. So I would highly recommend comparing prices for these services, to other services before making any final decisions. Okay. Another resource that would be really helpful along this path is the WISE program. So we are talking about water infrastructure and projects related to water. We did a Fund It Fast chat back in, I believe it was April, and we featured the Water Infrastructure Systems Efficiency, or WISE program. There's a lot of really good supplemental information that can be applied here as well. So we had a really special guest from a local contractor, Linkus, who currently administers the WISE program, which is a third-party program offered through all of our IOU partners. So there's some additional information if you'd like to go back and kind of look. That would help you along this path as well. I am going to give a quick check to our chat box here to see if we have any questions. And I don't see any questions here. So hopefully I did a good job of explaining everything. I will go ahead and give us a wrap up here. As always, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Please be on the lookout for our follow-up email later today. We also invite you to connect with the SJVCO team on social media, through email, or on our website. Our sole purpose is to connect you with resources that will help you get your projects done. I encourage everyone listening to please share the fast chat with your colleagues. If you know anyone that may benefit from this information, you never know how this information might inspire ideas for other projects, or you never know how this information might be helpful. So our next fast chat is already on the calendar for March 10th at 10 a.m. We will send out information on that topic very soon. In the meantime, if you'd like to listen to any of our past fast chats, you can find them at sjvcleanenergy.org. Again, that's sjvcleanenergy.org under the resources heading. Thank you everyone so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.